tend to think that our parents serve two purposes. One is to bring you to earth, and the other is to serve as an ATM. And so we we end up missing the finer points of why parents exist, especially we as the children. So parents exist for many fundamental reasons. And one of those reasons is to give you a free lesson in the things of life that you must never miss. So I'm going to tell you the story of my father, which for me is an incredible story of adversity, but how somebody can overcome quietly some of those challenges. And I will tell you what the problem was. First of all, my father was born in 1942, so he was actually born. As a kid, many of his friends and also his parents have told me that my father was exceptionally brilliant in school. And he tended towards the intellectual. He loved intellectual pursuits and he loved running. And occasionally played cricket, but mainly he loved reading and he absolutely loved writing and was a very disciplined student. In fact, as a result of that particular attribute, in 1963, he was one of the few Ugandans who was selected to go for a one-year attachment in the United States of America. So he lived in a place called Glastonbury in Connecticut for 1 year. Now, most of the people he went with didn't come back. But you see, my father believed that he was part of a generation that was destined to build a modern Uganda, so he came back. And so he went back to his high school, I think Chigezi College or Chigezi High School, one of those. And then, suddenly, about a year later, something went wrong with him. And all his friends were trying to figure out what has happened to Geoffrey. My father was called Geoffrey. And they couldn't figure out what it was, but his personality completely changed from somebody who had been a big debater, argumentative. I guess it's, that the fruit doesn't fall very far from the tree. So suddenly, this guy became very quiet. And then he stopped going to school. So after a while, he was then persuaded to go back to school. And then he went back to school and put in a wonderful academic performance and found himself at Makerere University. While at Makerere University, he recovered his old personality, went into a class to study philosophy and religious education, majoring in Islam. This is somebody from a Christian family. Majoring in Islam, became editor of the Makererian, which at that time was a very prestigious newspaper in Uganda, joined politics and managed to overthrow a government in Makerere, somebody called John Butime. In between there, had a son who was sitting here. And then he fell sick again. So he was out of university for a year and then came back. Oh, by the way, he also published 2 poems, and he had a lecturer called David Cook, and so there's a book, I don't know if it's still available, written by a collection of poems by David Cook and David Rubadiri. So he's one of the poets published there. So he always believed, by the way, that he was going to be one of the best writers out of East Africa. That he believed firmly until the day he died, so which is many years later. So anyway, he comes back, finishes his university, does well, goes, sits, he knows that the next thing he has to do is become a public servant. So he goes and sits for an interview. And he becomes, he's hired as a foreign service officer. 1 year later, he's asked to go and work in the Ugandan embassy in Moscow. 1.5 years into his service, he has to be brought back because he's very, very ill. Then it is established that my father had schizophrenia. But it's a problem that had been occurring from when he was the age of 14. And because of the time, the belief was that this was witchcraft. So nobody ever figured it could be a mental health problem. So he's then diagnosed with schizophrenia and depression. So you may not understand these things. Part of the problem with this issue is that it is actually a very bad stigma. So a lot of families that have this problem hide it. So my father then was out of work for a year because when you have schizophrenia, you are not okay, so you can't work. So he was out for maybe a year or so, and then he recovered. And then he came back to work in 1974. So he served diligently. In fact, he was so good at his job when he was okay that in that period, he was promoted twice. In one promotion, he's given what they call a double promotion because of excellence at work. And he took his work seriously. So anyway, two things happened to him. One, he was falsely accused of forging or selling Ugandan passports, diplomatic passports, to some people. So he was arrested and detained at a notorious jail which was run by Idi Amin called the Public Safety Unit. It was run by somebody called Kasim Obura. I don't want to go into that. If you go and read about our history, you will know. So when he comes out, he is then given the difficult task of joining the Ugandan delegation to go and explain to the world that the Archbishop of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Boga Zaire, as it was called then, Jana Nelumu, had died in a car accident. So in that whole delegation, he's the only one who came back. Everyone else stayed in New York and London. He's the only one who came back. So Idi Amin then calls him and says, now come and tell me what happened. Come and give me a brief. So he goes to State House in Entebbe, and Idi Amin tells him, actually, let's go on my boat. I want you to brief me when you are sailing on my boat. So Idi Amin had a fancy boat. He would ride from Entebbe to what you people call Munyonyo, but it was called Cape Town Villas. So he explained to him, and then he says, towards the end of their ride on the boat, Idi Amin asked him, have you ever thought about becoming a Muslim? And he said, now think about it. And that's the last time, because he realized that at that point there was a whole issue. You need to read our history. I don't want to go into it. So he fled Uganda because he realized, one, he had told a lie to the world. Two, Amin wouldn't trust him because he wasn't a Muslim, so he fled and went to Kenya. While he was in Kenya, he found work as a teacher, and again had another breakdown. While he was in Kenya, now he's not at home. Here, when he would break down, they would take him to the village. He would stay there, recover, come back on his own. After Idi Amin comes back, resumes his job as a foreign service officer, goes to work at the embassy in Denmark. And while he's in Denmark, he has this major breakdown. So he'd served 2-3 years, and then he has to come back. He has to be brought back to Uganda in a complete state of, he didn't have a clue where he was. So he spent 3 years living in the village. Life had ended. So in 1986, he cures on his own. Goes to the trading center, buys a razor blade, shaves his beard, puts on his suit, turns up in Kampala and goes to the ministry headquarters and says, I've come back for work. And they said, okay, so there's a desk for you. So they dumped him in a room and gave him a desk with no work. But every day, every single day, he woke up in the morning, was clean shaven, wore a suit, and walked to work every single day. Even though there was no work to be done, and even though nobody would give him work because they wanted him to get out. 2 years later, he broke down again. And he was taken back to the village, and he was in the village for 2 years, a complete wreck. So one day we were sitting there. They'd given him a week to come back to work because now his medical leave had run out. Then he turns up, clean shaven, smart, And then he told my mother, by the way, please iron for me my clothes. I was asked to report to work on June 30th. I actually intend to go to work. My mother tells him, are you out of your mind? He says, no, 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 I'm actually now in my mind. So he goes to work. And then he resumes his normal work, starts seeing his doctor again, takes his medication. Now, in 1993, a very important thing happened in the Ugandan public service. There was what was called a restructuring. So many, many people were laid off. And my father thinks that he survived because everyone forgot about him. Because he wasn't in a lucrative position, nobody cared, so they left him alone and he stayed. But he did exactly what he always did. He put on his clothes, he went to work, whatever little work they gave him, he did it diligently. Then one day, they needed somebody to go and work at a mission that no one was interested in working. And that mission was in Khartoum in Sudan. Nobody was interested in going to serve as a diplomat in Sudan. So they called him to mock him really, but they asked him, would you really want to go and serve in Sudan? He said, I'll go and serve anywhere. And he got onto a plane and went and served in Sudan until he was expelled. So from Sudan, he was moved to Ethiopia. From Ethiopia, he broke down again. Came back and he went to the ministry and said, I'm ill, I would like to retire. The ministry said, no, you're going to wait. He said, look, I can't work. They said, no, we know you can't work, but be patient. And they gave him one of the most honorable departures. They told him, the reason we've kept you long enough is we want to promote you to the highest level, which is the level of a full ambassador, and then retire you so you can have a decent pension. So he retired as an ambassador, had his full pension, lived a wonderful retirement life. The depression and schizophrenia got a little worse later on in life because his wife died, and then now he was on his own. And his son, because he was busy trying to build a career, didn't have very much time for him. He couldn't talk to his grandkids the way he wanted to. Then he suffered a stroke. And then finally one day he'd gone off to have a soda, and when he was walking back, he got a heart attack and he died. And we buried him. And so that's the man who in many ways influenced my life. So how? One, your parents give you a free lesson in life. Go back and look at their life and work out, what did your parents do? How did they do the things they did? And every parent has a lesson to offer. If your parent was abusing his spouse, that's also a lesson in what you should never do. If your parents treated each other with courtesy, if they never argued in public, they treated each other with respect. So my father had lessons for me that no one in the world has any obligation to teach me. It's my responsibility to learn them. I learned from him that life is a very serious matter. My father never joked about matters of life. So life is not a dress rehearsal. It's the real deal. This is it. None of us has come back to prove that there's life after death. Even then, we don't know what form it takes. So you better live this one properly. Be very clear about where you want to be. My father was very clear about what he wanted to be. He knew he wanted to be a civil servant, and that was it. No interest in politics, no interest in business, nothing. And he lived and he dedicated his life to that. And then focus. Once you have an idea, that's all he did. Then this man was incredibly disciplined. He knew he had to be at work at 8:30 and he would leave at 5. That's it. This man had determination and willpower. Not even schizophrenia would put him down. He worked for 28 years. So if you minus the 5 years of illness, that's 23, it's still better than many of you can ever hope to do so with the way you live life. Be dependable and reliable. It will pay off one day like it paid him off. So does hard work. Do not make choices lightly. My father never made choices lightly. And you see, you learn these things from your parents. My father never made choices lightly, never. It goes for who you marry, including who you're going to spend the night with, even if it's a one-night stand. Be very, very deliberate about that choice. Find a resource in yourself. My father never spent time going to public places. He just sat at home and read, or watched his TV, or wrote what he thought was going to be the most wonderful manuscript. No publisher was interested, so that's dead work. So you should learn to be with yourself alone. My father made mistakes. Many, some of them were very costly. But that also tells you that we're just human beings. And we should treat each other with respect, with courtesy. That's who we are. Never ever, never ever take people for a ride. It will be very costly. And that he said so. And then he always did things for their own purpose, because those things had to be done. He never expected to be celebrated or have adulation. The last lesson he taught me, he said, my son, please stay away from alcohol. And sadly, I didn't listen to him at the beginning. Later on I did, and I'm glad that I learned his lessons. Thank you.